Justice advocates have voiced serious concerns about the handling of funds earmarked for the relief efforts in KwaZulu-Natal. The province was declared a provincial state of disaster. This is normally a temporary mechanism to facilitate national government to assist the distressed provincial and local authorities. It also triggers the release of emergency funds from the National Treasury. Joining us now to explain the call for sound management of relief funds is social justice activist Busi Seabe. Very good afternoon to you. Thank you so much for your time. You are noting with concern as this call is being made out. We've heard various officials warning against the looting and the theft of and corruption of these funds that will be rolled out to access and assist the people of KwaZulu-Natal. What are your thoughts around this?
Thank you very much for having me, Mpo. I think one thing we must remember is that, during COVID-19, government departments and many officials used the Solidarity Fund, for an example, which was initially set up to mobilize money to help South Africans fight the COVID-19 pandemic. And they used the Solidarity Fund to enrich themselves, their families, and their acquaintances with little to no consequence management meted against them. So we are very quick to forget, and we shouldn't be in a large extent, we shouldn't be very quick to forget that an estimated 7.8 billion in COVID-19 corruption was uncovered by the SIU, and that, 50 billion estimated to have been stolen during state capture. So this is the backdrop with which, South Africans become very wary of the fact that our government has a serious legitimacy and credibility issue. And this is something that we need to be able to address, because when government fails and when government's legitimacy and credibility dwindles, as it normally does in this country, you find that civil society then needs to take up that mantle of assuming responsibility, which is essentially the responsibility of government. So it has become unsustainable for us to expect civil society to act in the space of government, that government should be acting, because we have a government with a big problem and inability to use funds well. We have had a clear and, we have consistently called for a clear strategy on how, civil society and government can work together to ensure that there is no corruption when it comes to, these flood funds that have been meted out, that there is no, backhandedness happening in the sense that, SIU gets involved and other stakeholders like Chapter 9 institutions should be getting involved. And I think that this is something that we should take into cognizance, because the DAs, for an example, Natasha Mazone, is somewhat correct in saying there is an urgent need for consistent oversight to be conducted by Parliament over a declared state of disaster on behalf of the public. And we see that this, we see that the Disaster Management Act does not provide for parliamentary oversight, thereby allowing the executive to use the act to bypass Parliament. So when you even hear from parties like the EFF as well, I'm inclined to agree with them when they say, and they call for the establishment of a multi-party committee to oversee the spending of the relief funding. And this is because of, the kind of history that we have when it comes to disaster management funds, when it comes to general corruption in the country that the ANC government has not been able to adequately address. I mean, recently, Premier's Sihle Zikalala had water delivered at his house, a water tank delivered at his house that was meant to go to a community and an area that is in need. And it's those kinds of, mismanagements of resources, mismanagement of funds that we are particularly worried about as South Africans, and we need to take very seriously.
Absolutely, and we perhaps also need to learn from the lessons of the PPE debacle, where we saw fly-by-night companies set up by some politicians who had inside knowledge of the contracts. I mean, as you speak, I know that some civil organizations, society organizations have suggested that there is a public register to really hold people accountable, to ensure transparency on what money was spent and to whom these contracts were allocated to.
Yes, definitely. I think one thing that we need to remember is that the government already abused the Disaster Management Act during during the COVID-19 pandemic. And when Parliament and its constitutionally mandated role of exercising oversight over the executive was all but forgotten, we found ourselves in a sticky situation where millions, in fact billions, went missing, and we now had to establish commissions and we had to establish investigations in order to track down the money. And even in finding out where that money went, there was no consequence management against individuals who had looted the money, who had stolen money, or who had, essentially used their friends or acquaintances to acquire tenders for particular services. So this is the backdrop with which we are consistently being meted with when it comes to our government. And it is very irresponsible for a government as old as ours, especially in light of, the COVID-19 pandemic, to not be prepared for any other disaster that may come in the future. So one question we should be asking ourselves is, why is our government perpetually unprepared for disasters? Why are we perpetually in a state where we have to worry about funds, where we have to worry about the fundamental basic principles that constitutes a government, that constitutes governance in our country, because of a leadership that is corrupt, because of a leadership that is out to benefit themselves and not necessarily to serve the constituency with which put them in those particular positions. So this becomes very interesting when you look at the dichotomy of, the haves and the have-nots. And if COVID-19 has not taught us anything, if the July unrest last year did not teach us anything, it is that South African citizens will take matters into their own hands if they feel that they have been, meted or put against a wall. And unfortunately, if resources aren't allocated adequately and people don't receive the necessary assistance they need to get, we will be getting more looting, we will be getting an increase in crime, we will be getting an increase in other socio-economic ills in our society, and we will further see a deterioration in our economy.
We see the question around preparedness also speaks to perhaps some oversight and foreseeing the impact of climate change. While, government officials speak about climate change and make mention of it, as we heard President Cyril Ramaphosa, the residents of KwaZulu-Natal have also spoken about the long-standing infrastructural issues that have already been in existence even before this tragedy.
Definitely. I mean, this is why we should be asking the important questions at this particular point in time. Why is it whenever there is a particular emergency that arises in this country, we are perpetually never ready? I mean, when you look at, there are various methods, of flood control that could have been practiced and have been practiced since ancient times, right? So these methods include the construction of floodways. These are man-made channels to divert flood water. Other techniques include the construction of reservoirs or, retention ponds to hold extra water during flooding. I mean, I myself do not have an engineering degree. I'm not qualified to be able to, discuss disaster management and flood control mechanisms. But I, particularly as an individual, am able to say that we as a country should have been ready, as many other countries are ready. When you look at London, for an example, when you look at Venice, when you look at Europe and the Americas, they're consistently ready to handle any and every kind of, environmental disaster that may come through. But when it comes to South Africa and the African continent as a whole, we seem to be lacking, because when you look at even what happened in Parliament, Parliament didn't even renew or essentially maintain its own buildings, emergency systems, and it ended up burning down to a large extent. This goes to speak to, the lack of institutional mechanisms within government. It goes to speak to the fact that our government is not prepared and does not know how to effectively run a country. We have a governance problem. We have an implementation problem. We have beautiful strategies and policies that are continuously being, put in place. But without people who are able to implement those policies, without people able to implement those legislations, we're going to have a situation where, we don't maintain roads, we don't maintain sewer sewage system that could have dealt with this flooding. There was a warning that was put out by the South African Weather Service to, to government about the possibility of flooding. They should have prepared then. But the fact that they didn't gives you an idea of the kind of government that we have, a government that is only prepared to engage citizens when they want votes, when it's election time, when it's time to celebrate something, but never when it's time to actually do what they're mandated to do.
Very well. Thank you so much for weighing in that discussion. Social justice activist Busi Seabe speaking to the